The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday evening, Alina Marsh's entire life had changed direction. She stood in the small kitchen of her rented flat in Manchester, reading the same paragraph for the fourth time, her tea growing cold beside her. The paper was thick and cream-colored, embossed with a crest she did not recognize. The words were formal, distant, almost cruel in their politeness. By order of His Grace, Duke Alastair Grantham, the property known as Thornfield Hall, situated in the county of Wiltshire, is hereby transferred in full to Miss Alina Marsh, effective immediately. There was no explanation, no warmth, just a signature, sharp and final, at the bottom of the page. Alina had met the Duke only twice in her life. Once at her late aunt's funeral, where he had stood at the back of the church wearing an expression of practiced sympathy, and once at a family gathering years before that, when she was still a teenager and he had barely looked at her at all. She was connected to his family only by a thin, tangled thread of marriage and distant blood, the kind of relation that shows up on paper but never in photographs. So why would a duke give away an entire estate to a woman he barely knew? She called the solicitor's office listed on the letterhead 3 times before someone finally answered. The voice on the other end was clipped and unhelpful. "The Duke's instructions were clear, Miss Marsh. The property is yours. There are no further details to share." "But why me? Why now?" There was a pause on the line, long enough that Alina wondered if the call had dropped. "I was told to tell you one thing if you asked," the solicitor finally said. "The Duke wishes for you to enjoy your inheritance far away from London." The words landed like a slap. Far away from London, far away from him. This was not a gift. This was a removal, a polite, expensive way of making a woman disappear from a family that had never wanted her close in the first place. Alina sat with that truth for 3 days before she decided what to do. She could sell the estate, take whatever money it brought, and disappear back into her ordinary life. It would be the easy choice, the choice that avoided drama and long drives to unfamiliar counties. But something about the letter, about the strange urgency behind it, refused to let her go quietly. If the Duke wanted her gone that badly, there had to be a reason. And Alina Marsh had never been the kind of woman who backed away from a locked door without at least trying the handle. She packed 2 suitcases, told her landlord she would be gone for a few weeks, and began the long drive south. The countryside changed slowly at first, then all at once. Manchester's grey streets gave way to rolling green hills, then to narrow lanes lined with hedgerows so tall they blocked the sky. By the time her small car turned onto the private road leading to Thornfield Hall, the afternoon light had turned amber and heavy, the kind of light that makes old stone look like it is glowing from within. Her first sight of the house stole the breath from her chest. Thornfield Hall was enormous, built of grey stone that had darkened with age and weather. 3 stories rose above her, with tall windows that reflected the sunset in fractured, uneven patterns. Ivy had climbed halfway up the western wall, thick and green, wrapping around broken shutters and cracked window frames. The roofline sagged in places, and one of the chimneys leaned at an angle that made Alina's stomach tighten just looking at it. The gardens, once surely magnificent, had grown wild. Rose bushes had become tangled thickets, and the gravel drive was cracked with weeds pushing through in defiant green lines. A stone fountain stood dry and cracked in the center of the courtyard, its once elegant figure of a woman now missing an arm. It was beautiful and broken at the same time, like something out of a story that had been left unfinished. Alina parked her car and stepped out slowly, the gravel crunching beneath her shoes. The silence surrounding the estate was thick, broken only by the distant call of a bird and the soft rustle of wind through the ivy. No traffic, no voices, nothing but the house and the land around it waiting. She had barely reached the front steps when a voice called out from the side of the building. "You must be Miss Marsh." An elderly man emerged from what looked like a caretaker's cottage, tucked behind a row of overgrown hedges. He was tall despite a slight stoop in his shoulders, with white hair combed neatly to one side and sharp, watchful eyes that studied her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "I am," Alina said, extending a hand. "And you are?" "Higgins," he said, shaking her hand firmly. "I've kept this place standing, more or less, for the better part of 40 years. Someone has to, even when the family forgets it exists." There was something in the way he said "forgets" that made Alina pause. "The Duke gave me the house," she said carefully, watching his reaction. Higgins's expression flickered, just for a moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "Yes," he said slowly, "I received word a few days ago." "I confess, Miss Marsh, I was surprised." "Surprised that he gave it away, or surprised that he gave it to me?" Higgins did not answer right away. Instead, he gestured toward the heavy front doors, their wood dark and weathered, iron hinges rusted at the edges. "Perhaps it's best if you see the house first," he said. "Some things are easier understood once you've walked the halls." It was not the answer Alina wanted, but she let it go, at least for now. Something told her that pushing too hard, too fast, would only close doors that were already reluctant to open. The interior of Thornfield Hall was even more overwhelming than the outside had promised. The entrance hall stretched upward 2 full stories, with a grand staircase curving along the far wall, its banister carved with intricate patterns of leaves and vines. Dust covered nearly every surface, thick and undisturbed, as though time itself had simply stopped moving through these rooms. Portraits lined the walls, their painted eyes following Alina as she stepped further inside, faces of ancestors she had never known wearing clothes from decades long past. "How long has it been since anyone lived here properly?" Alina asked, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "Properly," Higgins repeated as though weighing the word. "Not since before the war. There have been caretakers, groundskeepers, the occasional visit from a family solicitor checking on the state of things. But lived in, Miss Marsh, not for a very long time. And the Duke never came here himself." "Rarely, and when he did he never stayed long. He always seemed uneasy being inside these walls." Alina filed that detail away carefully. A duke, uneasy in his own family estate. That was not the reaction of a man who simply found the house inconvenient. That was the reaction of a man avoiding something. Higgins led her through the ground floor first, room after room revealing faded elegance beneath layers of dust and neglect. A grand dining room with a table long enough to seat 20, chairs still tucked neatly beneath it as though waiting for guests who would never arrive. A library with shelves reaching to the ceiling, books swollen with damp, their spines cracked and faded. A drawing room with furniture draped in white sheets, ghostly shapes in the dim afternoon light filtering through grimy windows. Every room told the same story. Wealth once immense, now abandoned. Beauty left to decay because no one cared enough, or perhaps no one dared enough, to bring it back to life. As the sun began to set outside, painting the dusty windows in shades of orange and rose, Higgins led Alina up the grand staircase toward the bedrooms on the 2nd floor. "I've prepared a room for you," he said. "It's the only one properly aired and dusted. The others, I'm afraid, are not fit for sleeping just yet." He stopped outside a heavy wooden door near the end of a long corridor, its surface carved with the same leaf and vine pattern as the staircase banister. He pushed it open, revealing a bedroom that, while worn with age, showed clear signs of recent care. Fresh linens covered the bed. The windows had been cleaned enough to let in real light. A small fireplace sat cold but swept clean in the corner. "This should suit you for tonight," Higgins said. "I'll bring up something to eat shortly. There's a kitchen in working order, though I'd advise patience with the plumbing throughout the house. Old bones, this place. Everything creaks and complains before it cooperates." Alina thanked him, and once he had gone, she stood alone in the room for a long moment, taking in her surroundings properly for the first time. It was then that she noticed the portrait. It hung on the wall opposite the bed, slightly crooked, as though someone had bumped it long ago and never bothered to straighten it again. The painting showed a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, wearing a pale blue dress that seemed to belong to another era entirely. Her hair was dark and pinned back in soft waves, her expression caught somewhere between a smile and something more guarded, more careful. But it was her eyes that held Alina's attention. They seemed to follow her, no matter where she stood in the room, dark and searching, filled with an emotion Alina could not quite name. Longing, perhaps, or warning. There was no plaque, no name beneath the frame to identify who she was. Alina stepped closer, studying the details of the painting. The woman's hands were folded in her lap, and on one finger, painted with careful precision, sat a small ring with a dark stone. Behind her, faintly visible through a window in the painted background, stood a shape that looked remarkably like Thornfield Hall itself, though rendered smaller and slightly different, as though painted from memory rather than direct sight. "Who are you?" Alina murmured to the portrait, "and why does no one want to say your name?" The room offered no answer, only silence and the soft creak of old wood settling as the temperature dropped with the coming night. Later, after a simple meal of bread, cheese, and soup that Higgins brought up on a tray, Alina lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring up at a ceiling she could barely see in the darkness. The house around her groaned softly, the sounds of old timber and stone adjusting to the night's chill. Somewhere far below, she thought she heard the faint creak of a door, though she told herself it was only the wind finding its way through some gap in the ancient walls. Sleep came slowly, tangled with thoughts of dukes and portraits and a house that seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. Or someone. Just before she drifted off completely, Alina's eyes opened once more, drawn back to the portrait across the room, barely visible now in the darkness except for the faint outline of pale blue fabric and dark, watching eyes. She did not know it yet, but that portrait would change everything she thought she understood about the Duke, about Thornfield Hall, and about the family that had tried so hard to send her away. Whatever had been buried within these walls, hidden and silent for 90 years, had just found someone willing to listen. And somewhere in London, in a townhouse far removed from the dust and decay of Thornfield Hall, Duke Alastair Grantham sat alone in his study, staring at a letter he had not sent, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake in giving that house away at all. Alina woke before dawn to the sound of rain tapping gently against her window, a soft rhythm that seemed to match the slow, steady beat of her own heart. For a moment she forgot where she was, her mind still tangled in half-formed dreams of dark eyes and pale blue dresses. Then the unfamiliar ceiling above her, the cold air of an old house, and the faint smell of dust and stone brought reality rushing back. She lay still for a while, listening to the house around her. It creaked and settled in ways that felt almost alive, as though Thornfield Hall itself were breathing slowly through the walls. Somewhere below, she heard the distant clatter of pots, a sign that Higgins was already awake and moving about the kitchen. By the time she dressed and made her way downstairs, the rain had softened to a light mist, and pale morning light filtered weakly through the grimy windows of the hallway. She found Higgins in the kitchen, a small but functional room that seemed to have escaped the worst of the estate's decline. A pot of tea sat steaming on the table, along with toast and a simple spread of butter and jam. "Sleep well?" Higgins asked, not looking up from the stove. "As well as one can, in a house full of strangers watching from the walls," Alina replied, taking a seat. Higgins allowed himself a small smile. "The portraits do have a way of unsettling new visitors. You'll grow used to them." "There's one in my room," Alina said carefully, watching his face. "A young woman in a blue dress, no name beneath it. Do you know who she is?" The smile faded from Higgins's face almost instantly, replaced by something more guarded. He busied himself with pouring tea, his movements just a touch too deliberate, too careful. "There are many portraits in this house, Miss Marsh. Not all of them come with a story, I know. But that one does," Alina pressed gently. "I can see it in your face." Higgins set the teapot down with a soft clink and finally met her eyes. There are things in this house best left undisturbed. I say that not to frighten you, but because I have lived alongside this estate's silence for a very long time, and I have learned that some silences exist for good reason. And if I don't want to leave it undisturbed, then I suspect you'll find your answers regardless of what I say, Higgins replied, a note of resignation in his voice. You have the look of someone who does not let go of a question once it's taken hold. Elena smiled despite herself. You're not wrong. Breakfast continued in a more comfortable silence after that, though Elena's mind kept drifting back to the portrait, to the strange weight of Higgins's reluctance. Whatever secret this house held, it clearly touched him too, in ways he was not yet ready to share. After breakfast, Higgins offered to show her the rest of the house properly, room by room, floor by floor. Elena agreed eagerly, eager to understand the full scope of what she had inherited, and perhaps, if she was fortunate, to stumble upon some clue about the mysterious woman in blue. The second floor held a maze of bedrooms, most closed off with sheets draped over furniture, the air inside heavy and stale. Higgins explained the history of each room as best he could, though much of it was guesswork passed down from previous caretakers rather than firm fact. This was the nursery floor once, he said, gesturing down a narrower corridor branching off from the main hallway, though it hasn't held a child in generations. Elena peered down the corridor and noticed something odd. Unlike the other hallways, this one ended in a heavy door, different from the others in style, older, its wood darker and more weathered. A thick iron lock secured it, rusted but clearly still functional. Why is that one locked? She asked. Higgins's expression tightened again, the same guarded look from breakfast returning to his face. That's the east wing, Miss Marsh. It's been sealed for as long as I've worked here. Sealed by whom? The family, long before my time. I was told it was closed due to structural concerns, unsafe flooring, that sort of thing. I never questioned it further. Elena studied the door for a long moment, noting the way the lock, despite its rust, seemed well maintained compared to the general decay surrounding it. Someone had cared for that lock, even while letting everything else fall into ruin. That was not the behavior of a family worried about a few weak floorboards. Do you have the key? She asked. Higgins hesitated, his fingers unconsciously drifting toward a ring of keys hanging from his belt. I do, though I was instructed long ago never to use it without explicit permission from the family. I am the family now in a manner of speaking, Elena said gently. The Duke gave me this house. Doesn't that include the East Wing? Legally, I suppose it does, Higgins admitted, though something tells me the Duke did not expect you to ask for that key quite so soon. Then perhaps that's exactly why I should ask for it now. Higgins studied her for a long moment, some internal debate playing out behind his careful eyes. Finally, with a small sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 40 years of unspoken questions, he reached for the key ring and began sorting through the old, tarnished keys until he found one distinctly older and darker than the rest. I will warn you, Miss Marsh, that once certain doors are opened, they rarely close again the same way. Whatever lies beyond that door has been waiting a very long time. I cannot promise you'll like what you find. I didn't come here for comfort, Higgins, Elena said quietly. I came here for answers. He handed her the key, its metal cold and heavy in her palm. Then I suppose it's only right that you should be the one to use it. They approached the heavy door together, Higgins holding an old oil lamp despite the daylight, explaining that the East Wing had never been fitted properly with electricity, another sign of just how long it had remained forgotten. The lock resisted at first, stiff with age, but after a firm twist and a solid push against the door, it gave way with a groan that echoed down the empty corridor. The air that rushed out to meet them was cold and stale, carrying the unmistakable scent of dust and something else beneath it, something faintly sweet and old, like dried flowers pressed between the pages of a forgotten book. Elena stepped inside first, Higgins following close behind with the lamp raised to illuminate the darkness. The corridor beyond the door was narrower than the rest of the house. The wallpaper faded to a pale, ghostly pattern of what had once been vibrant floral print. Several doors lined the hallway, all closed, all coated in the same thick layer of undisturbed dust. This was the nursery wing, Higgins explained softly, his voice hushed as though speaking too loudly might disturb something sleeping. Before it was sealed. Alina moved slowly down the corridor, running her fingers lightly along the wall, feeling the texture of decades of neglect beneath her fingertips. She stopped at the first door and pushed it open carefully. Inside was exactly what Higgins had promised. A nursery frozen in time. A small wooden cradle sat in the center of the room, draped in a moth-eaten blanket that had once likely been white but had yellowed with age. A rocking horse stood in the corner, its painted surface chipped and faded, one glass eye missing entirely. Shelves along the wall held old toys, dolls with cracked porcelain faces, wooden blocks scattered as though a child had simply stepped away mid-play and never returned. Alina felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the cold air of the sealed room. "Whose nursery was this?" she asked softly. "I don't know for certain," Higgins admitted. "The records from that era are incomplete, and what remains has never been fully explained to me." Alina moved further into the room, drawn toward a small writing desk tucked into the corner near the window, its surface still holding a few scattered items, a dried inkwell, a broken pen, and what appeared to be a stack of yellowed papers bound loosely together. She approached carefully, almost reverently, and lifted the papers with gentle hands, the pages brittle and fragile beneath her touch. It was a diary. The handwriting was elegant but hurried in places. The ink faded to a soft brown that made some words difficult to read. Alina carefully opened to the first page, her heart beginning to race as she read the name written carefully at the top. Margaret Lowell, her private thoughts. Begun this spring of 1935. "Higgins," Alina said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think I've found her." Higgins moved closer, peering over her shoulder at the faded handwriting, his expression shifting from caution to something closer to genuine surprise. "Margaret Lowell," he repeated slowly. "I've never heard that name spoken in this house, not once in all my years here." "She's the woman in the portrait," Alina said, certainty settling into her voice even as the pieces continued to align in her mind. This was her room, her nursery, her diary. But why would her portrait hang in a guest bedroom, while her most private possessions sit locked away in a sealed wing, forgotten by everyone? Higgins asked, more to himself than to Alina. Alina did not have an answer, not yet. But as she carefully turned the pages of Margaret's diary, skimming entries filled with hopeful dreams and quiet worries, she felt a growing certainty that this house had far more secrets buried within its walls than a simple locked door and a dusty nursery. Something significant had happened here, decades ago, something the family had worked hard to erase from memory entirely. And Margaret Lowell, whoever she truly was, had left behind more than just toys and dust. She had left behind a voice, waiting patiently across the decades for someone willing to listen. Alina closed the diary gently and tucked it carefully under her arm. "I think," she said slowly, "we need to read this properly." "All of it?" Higgins nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "And when you're finished, Miss Marsh, what then?" Alina looked around the frozen nursery one final time, at the small cradle and the forgotten toys, at the layers of dust that had settled over what once must have been a room full of hope and life. "Then," she said quietly, "I'm going to find out exactly what happened to her, and why an entire family has spent 90 years pretending she never existed at all." Outside, the rain began to fall harder against the windows of Thornfield Hall, as though the house itself understood that its long silence was finally, irrevocably, coming to an end. They spent the remainder of the morning carefully searching the other rooms of the sealed wing, though none held quite the same significance as the nursery. A small sitting room revealed nothing but faded furniture and empty shelves. A modest bedroom, presumably meant for a nursemaid or governess, offered little beyond an old wardrobe filled with clothing too fragile to touch without risk of it crumbling entirely. It was in the final room, a small study tucked at the very end of the corridor, that Alina found something else worth noting. A wooden trunk, its surface scratched and worn, sat beneath a boarded window. Unlike the other furniture in the wing, this trunk showed signs of having been opened and closed more recently, the dust pattern around its edges disturbed in ways the rest of the room was not. "Someone has been in here," Alina said, crouching beside the trunk, "and not that long ago, comparatively speaking." Higgins frowned, kneeling beside her to examine the dust patterns for himself. "You may be right, though I can't imagine who. I hold the only key to this wing, and I have not entered these rooms in years, save to ensure the roof still holds." Alina tried the trunk's latch, finding it unlocked, the metal clasp swinging open easily despite its rusted appearance. Inside, she found a collection of items that seemed strangely out of place among the older relics of the nursery. A folded newspaper clipping, yellowed but not nearly as aged as everything else in the room. A small leather-bound notebook, different from Margaret's diary, with handwriting that looked more modern, more recent. She unfolded the newspaper clipping first, smoothing it carefully against her knee. It was a brief article, dated some 20 years ago, discussing a legal matter involving the Grantham estate, something about disputed inheritance rights and a sealed portion of the family archive. The article was frustratingly vague, offering no specific names beyond a brief mention of irregularities in the family record from the mid-1930s. 20 years ago, Alina murmured. Someone was already asking questions about this, long before I ever received that letter. She turned to the leather notebook next, opening it to find pages filled with careful, methodical notes, clearly the work of someone conducting a private investigation of their own. Names, dates, small diagrams connecting various pieces of information, and at the top of the first page, a single line that made Alina's breath catch in her throat. If Margaret's child survived, the entire Grantham inheritance is built on a lie. "Higgins," Alina said slowly, holding up the notebook with trembling hands, "I don't think I'm the first person to come looking for the truth in this house." Higgins stared at the notebook, his weathered face pale in the dim lamplight. "No," he said quietly, a note of genuine fear creeping into his voice for the first time since Alina had met him. "And given how carefully this trunk was hidden, I suspect whoever came before you did not finish what they started." The rain outside intensified, drumming steadily against the sealed windows of the east wing, as though the storm itself understood the weight of what had just been uncovered. Alina tucked both the newspaper clipping and the mysterious notebook alongside Margaret's diary, her mind racing with questions that seemed to multiply faster than she could possibly answer them. Who had left this trunk here, and why? What had happened to them? And most pressingly, what exactly did they discover about Margaret's child? And why would that discovery threaten the entire foundation of the Grantham family's inheritance? "We should return to the main house," Higgins said, glancing nervously toward the darkened windows. "I don't like the feeling of this place, not today." Alina agreed, though as she took one last look around the small study before following Higgins back down the corridor, she noticed something she had missed before. Carved into the wooden windowsill, half hidden beneath years of dust, were 3 simple words, scratched deep enough into the wood to have survived decades of neglect. "They took her." Alina stood frozen for a long moment, staring at those 3 words, feeling the full weight of the mystery settle heavily over her shoulders. Whatever had happened to Margaret Lowell 90 years ago, it had not been a simple disappearance, a quiet family scandal quickly forgotten. Someone had taken her. And somewhere, buried within the pages of a forgotten diary and a stranger's secret notebook, the truth of exactly what that meant was waiting patiently to be uncovered at last. That night, Alina could not bring herself to sleep. She sat cross-legged on the bed in her borrowed room, the portrait of Margaret Lowell watching silently from the wall as she opened the fragile diary once more, this time determined to read every page from beginning to end. The early entries were light, almost cheerful, filled with the small observations of a young woman enjoying her days at a grand country estate. Margaret wrote of long walks through the gardens when they had still been full of color, of quiet evenings reading in the library, of gentle teasing exchanged with someone she referred to only as E, a nickname that gave no immediate clue to his full identity. Alina flipped forward several pages, watching as the tone of the entries slowly shifted, growing warmer, more intimate, filled with a kind of breathless excitement that seemed to leap off the aged paper despite the passage of 90 years. He kissed my hand today, beside the old fountain, and told me he had never felt such peace with anyone before. I fear I am falling in a way I cannot control, and I do not know if that is a blessing or a terrible mistake. Alina read on, piecing together fragments of a love story that had clearly blossomed within these very walls. E, whoever he was, seemed to hold a position within the household, though Margaret was careful never to write his full name, as though even her private diary was not safe enough for such a dangerous secret. Several weeks of entries later, the tone shifted again, this time toward something more anxious, more fearful. I told him today. He went pale as I have never seen him, and for a long moment I feared he might leave me entirely. But he took my hands and promised we would find a way, that no family name, however powerful, could keep us from building a life together. I want desperately to believe him. Alina's heart ached reading those words, imagining the fear and hope tangled together in Margaret's chest as she wrote them. A pregnancy, clearly, and a lover determined to stand by her despite whatever obstacles their families might place in their path. The following entries grew shorter, more hurried, as though Margaret had less time and more caution than before. She wrote of being watched more closely, of a growing coldness from someone she referred to only as the old Duke, a phrase that made Alina pause and reconsider everything she thought she understood about the timeline of this tragedy. The old Duke, not Alastair Grantham, the current Duke who had given her this house, but someone from an earlier generation entirely. Perhaps his grandfather, or even great-grandfather, depending on how far back the family line extended. Alina continued reading, hungry now for every detail, every clue that might help her understand exactly what had happened to this young woman so many decades ago. Father visited today, though I do not know how he learned the truth. He would not look at me directly, only spoke in low tones with the old Duke behind closed doors. I was not permitted to hear what was said, though I could feel the weight of it pressing against every wall of this house. He came to me after, his face grave in a way that frightened me more than anger ever could. He said we must be patient, that plans were being made to protect us both, though he would not explain further. I trust him with my whole heart, yet I cannot shake the feeling that something terrible is approaching, something neither of us can outrun no matter how carefully we plan. Alina set the diary down for a moment, rubbing her tired eyes, trying to process the weight of what she was reading. A forbidden love, a hidden pregnancy, a furious family determined to control the situation by any means necessary. It was the kind of story that might have played out in countless great houses across England during that era, women silenced and hidden away to protect family reputation. But something about the specific details, the mention of an old Duke, the desperate secrecy, suggested this particular story had ended in something far darker than a simple quiet exile. She picked the diary back up and continued reading, moving toward the final entries, the ones written in increasingly hurried, almost frantic handwriting. They mean to send me away. He told me tonight, his voice breaking as he spoke the words. Not to a quiet cottage somewhere discreet as I had hoped, but somewhere far more permanent, somewhere I would never be able to return from, nor would our child ever know the truth of who I truly was. I begged him to run with me, tonight if necessary, before they could carry out whatever plan they have arranged. He agreed, though I could see the fear in his eyes, the knowledge of exactly what defying his own family would cost him. We are to leave 3 nights from now, under cover of darkness, taking only what we can carry. If this diary is ever found, and I pray it will be found by someone kind enough to understand, know that I loved him completely, and that whatever happened to me afterward, I did not go quietly into whatever fate they intended. Alina's hands trembled as she turned to the final page, expecting perhaps one more entry, some small note of hope or farewell. Instead, the page was blank. The diary simply ended there, mid-story, the promised escape 3 nights away never recorded, never confirmed as having happened or failed. Whatever became of Margaret Lowell after that final desperate entry remained a mystery, swallowed entirely by 90 years of careful family silence. Alina closed the diary slowly, her mind spinning with questions. If Margaret and E had escaped successfully, why would her portrait still hang in this house, and why would her nursery remain sealed and untouched for nearly a century? And if they had not escaped, if the family had somehow intervened before their planned departure, what exactly had happened to her? The words carved into the windowsill returned to her mind with fresh, chilling weight. They took her. Alina barely slept that night, her dreams tangled with images of a young woman running through dark gardens, chased by shadows she could never quite outrun. The following morning, she found Higgins already awake in the kitchen, his face lined with the particular exhaustion of someone who had also slept poorly. "I finished the diary," Alina said without preamble, sliding into a chair across from him. "Margaret was in love with someone in this household, someone she only ever refers to as she was pregnant, and the family, an earlier duke, was planning to send her away permanently." Higgins listened in silence, his expression carefully neutral, though Alina noticed his hands tightening slightly around his teacup. "She planned to run away with this person," Alina continued. "3 nights before her final entry, the diary ends there, nothing after." "And you believe something prevented that escape?" Higgins said quietly. "I believe someone in this family made certain it never happened," Alina replied. "I need to find out who was. If he's still alive, even at this age, he may be the only person who truly knows what happened that night." Higgins was quiet for a long moment, staring down into his tea as though searching for answers in its dark surface. "There is someone who might help," he said eventually. "A woman in the village, quite elderly now, whose family has lived in the shadow of this estate for generations. If anyone remembers the old stories, the true stories rather than whatever version the family allowed to survive, it would be her." "Then I think it's time I paid her a visit," Alina said, determination hardening in her voice. Outside, the rain had finally cleared, leaving behind a sky washed pale and clean, as though the storm had scrubbed away some of the heaviness that had settled over Thornfield Hall the previous night. But Alina knew better than to mistake clear skies for an ending. If anything, the true storm was only just beginning to gather, 90 years in the making, and she intended to stand directly in its path until every last secret had been dragged into the light. Before making the journey to the village, Alina decided there was one conversation she could not avoid any longer. She retrieved the letter with the solicitor's number, and after several rings, a familiar clipped voice answered on the other end. "I need to speak with the Duke directly," Alina said, her tone leaving no room for the usual deflection. "Not through you, him." There was a pause, followed by a resigned sigh. "I will see what can be arranged, Miss Marsh." To Alina's surprise, the call came back within the hour, and this time it was not the solicitor's voice on the line, but a deeper, more measured tone she recognized faintly from the 2 brief encounters years before. "Miss Marsh," Duke Alastair Grantham said, his voice carefully controlled, "I understand you have questions." "I found a diary," Alina said, deciding there was no benefit in easing into the conversation gently. "Margaret Lowell's diary. I found her nursery, sealed away in the East Wing. I found a trunk left behind by someone who came looking for the truth long before I ever did." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Alina wondered if the call had disconnected entirely. "You should not have gone into that wing," the Duke finally said, his voice tighter now, stripped of its earlier composure. "Why not? You gave me this house. Everything in it belongs to me now, doesn't it?" "There are matters that predate you, Miss Marsh. Matters that have nothing to do with the property itself, and everything to do with protecting people who are no longer able to protect themselves." "Protecting them or protecting your family's reputation?" Alina asked sharply. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a young woman was taken from this house against her will 90 years ago, and everyone since has simply agreed to pretend she never existed at all." "You know nothing of what happened," the Duke snapped, his composure finally cracking entirely. "You are stirring up a tragedy you do not understand, digging through pain that was buried for good reason." "Then explain it to me," Alina pressed. "If there's a reason good enough to justify sealing away an entire nursery for 90 years, tell me what it is. Because right now, all I see is a family with something to hide, and a man who gave away his own estate simply to keep one curious woman far away from London." Another long silence followed, heavier this time, filled with something that sounded almost like exhaustion. "I will offer you a fair price for the property," the Duke said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "More than fair. Enough to secure your future entirely if you agree to leave Thornfield Hall and never speak of what you found within it." "You're trying to buy my silence," Alina said slowly, the realization settling cold and heavy in her chest. "I am trying to protect what remains of this family," the Duke replied. "Please, Miss Marsh, take the offer. Some doors are better left closed." "I'm afraid it's too late for that," Alina said. "The door is already open, Your Grace, and I intend to walk through it whether you approve or not." She ended the call before he could respond further, her hands trembling slightly as she set the phone down on the kitchen table. Higgins, who had been quietly listening from across the room, regarded her with an expression that mixed concern and something that looked almost like admiration. "He offered to buy the house back," Alina said, though it was hardly a question. "I imagine he did," Higgins replied, "and judging by your expression, I imagine you refused." "He wants me gone badly enough to offer real money for it," Alina said. "That tells me everything I need to know about how important it is that I stay." Higgins nodded slowly, though worry remained etched clearly across his weathered face. "Then I suppose we should visit the village sooner rather than later. If the Duke is growing desperate enough to make such an offer, I fear he may not stop there." Alina felt a small chill at his words, but beneath the unease, something else was growing steadily stronger, a fierce and stubborn determination that refused to be shaken. Margaret Lowell had waited 90 years for someone willing to fight for the truth on her behalf. Alina did not intend to let her wait any longer. The village of Hollowmere sat nestled in a shallow valley some 3 miles from Thornfield Hall, a small collection of stone cottages, a modest church with a crooked steeple, and a single narrow street lined with shops that looked as though they had changed very little in the past century. Alina drove slowly through the quiet lanes, following Higgins's directions toward a cottage at the far edge of the village, half hidden behind a wall of climbing roses. "Nora Whitfield has lived here her entire life," Higgins explained as they approached the small gate. "Her grandmother worked in service at Thornfield Hall, back in the days when the estate still employed half the village. If any family stories survived outside those walls, they survived through women like Nora." The cottage door opened before they even reached it, revealing a small, sharp-eyed woman who looked to be in her late 80s, her silver hair pulled back neatly, her posture surprisingly straight for her age. She studied Alina with obvious curiosity, her gaze quick and assessing. "So you're the one," Nora said, before either of them could offer a proper introduction. "The one the Duke gave the old house to." "Word travels quickly," Alina said. "In a village this small, word travels before it even has anywhere proper to go," Nora replied, stepping back to allow them inside. Come in then, both of you. I suspect you haven't come for tea and pleasant conversation. The interior of the cottage was warm and cluttered in a comforting way, filled with framed photographs, faded quilts, and the gentle smell of dried lavender. Nora settled them into a small sitting room and disappeared briefly into the kitchen, returning with a pot of tea and a plate of biscuits that she set down with the efficiency of long practice. Now then, she said, taking her own seat across from Alina, what exactly did you find up at that old house that's brought you knocking on my door? Margaret Lowell, Alina said simply, watching closely for Nora's reaction. The old woman's hands went still around her teacup, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. Now there's a name I haven't heard spoken aloud in a great many years. Then you knew her, or knew of her? My grandmother worked in that house as a young housemaid, Nora said slowly. She spoke of Miss Lowell sometimes, though never freely, never without glancing over her shoulder first, even decades later, even after the old Duke himself had long since passed. What did she tell you? Alina asked, leaning forward. Nora was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the window, toward the distant hills where Thornfield Hall stood hidden from view. My grandmother said Miss Lowell was a distant relation of the family, brought to live at the estate after her own parents passed, taken in more out of obligation than genuine affection. A poor relation, you might say, tolerated but never truly welcomed. There was a man, Alina said, someone she referred to only by the initial E. Do you know who that might have been? Something shifted in Nora's expression, a flicker of old sorrow crossing her weathered features. Edmund, she said quietly. Edmund Caro. He worked as the estate's head groundskeeper, a good man by all accounts, hardworking and well-liked among the staff. My grandmother said he and Miss Lowell had grown close over their shared love of the gardens, though such a match was, of course, entirely unacceptable to the family. A groundskeeper and a distant relation of the Duke, Alina murmured. No wonder the family reacted so harshly. It was more than simple disapproval, Nora continued, her voice dropping lower, as though even now, so many decades later, the story still felt dangerous to speak aloud. My grandmother said there was a great scandal that spring, hushed quickly by the family before it could spread beyond the estate walls. Miss Lowell disappeared entirely, virtually overnight. The official story, the one the family allowed to circulate, claimed she had been sent abroad to live with distant relatives for the sake of her health. But you don't believe that story, Alina said. My grandmother never believed it, Nora said firmly. She said the servants whispered for years afterward that no letters ever arrived from Miss Lowell, no word of her well-being, nothing to confirm she had truly gone anywhere at all. And Edmund Caro, the groundskeeper, vanished from the estate that same week, dismissed suddenly without explanation, his belongings sent after him to an address that, as far as anyone could determine, did not actually exist. Alina felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. They separated them, she said quietly. Whatever plan they had to run away together, the family discovered it and stopped it before it could happen. That was always my grandmother's belief, Nora agreed, though she never knew the full truth of what became of either of them after that. There was an inquest some years later, when questions finally arose about Miss Lowell's continued absence. But the inquest concluded quickly, quietly, without any real answers offered to the public. The family closed ranks entirely, and eventually the whole affair simply faded from memory, at least outside these village walls. An inquest, Alina repeated slowly. That means someone official believed there was reason for concern, reason to investigate. There was a local inspector at the time, a man named Bennett, who apparently pressed harder than the family appreciated, Nora said. My grandmother said he made several visits to the estate, asking questions that made the household staff distinctly uncomfortable. But nothing ever came of his inquiries, at least not publicly. He retired not long after, moved away from the county entirely, and the matter was never spoken of again. Alina's mind raced, connecting pieces of information that were slowly forming a clearer, more disturbing picture. A forbidden love between Margaret and Edmund, a family determined to prevent their escape by any means necessary, an official inquest that mysteriously produced no answers. And decades later, someone else, whoever had left that trunk in the sealed nursery, had clearly begun investigating the very same questions, only to disappear from the story just as thoroughly as Margaret herself. "Do you know what happened to Inspector Bennet?" Alina asked. "Where he went after he left the county?" Nora shook her head slowly. "I'm afraid that's a detail lost even to my grandmother's memory, though if records still exist anywhere, it would likely be in the county archives, or perhaps within old newspaper files from that era." "There's something else," Alina said, retrieving the notebook she had found in the sealed trunk, showing Nora the handwritten notes about the disputed inheritance. "Someone else came looking for answers, roughly 20 years ago. Do you have any idea who that might have been?" Nora studied the notebook carefully, her brow furrowing in concentration. "I do recall something now that you mention it," she said slowly. "A young man came through the village. Oh, it must have been close to 20 years back now. He asked a great many questions about the old estate, about the Grantham family history. He stayed several weeks, I believe, though he never explained exactly what he was searching for." "Do you remember his name?" "I'm afraid not," Nora admitted, "though my late husband spoke with him a few times at the local pub. He mentioned once that the young man seemed convinced there was some grave injustice buried within the Grantham family's history, something he intended to expose no matter the personal cost." "And then," Alina pressed, "what happened to him?" Nora's expression grew troubled. "He simply stopped coming around one day to the next. No farewell, no explanation. Some assumed he had simply given up his search and moved along, as strangers often do. Others whispered that perhaps the family had grown tired of his questions and found a way to encourage his departure more forcefully." The implication hung heavy in the small, warm sitting room, and Alina felt a fresh wave of unease settle over her. Whoever this mysterious investigator had been, he had come remarkably close to the same discoveries Alina herself was now making, only to vanish from the story entirely, his notebook and findings left hidden and forgotten in a locked trunk within a sealed nursery. "I need to find out who he was," Alina said firmly, "and I need to find any surviving records from Inspector Bennet's original inquest, if such records still exist anywhere." Nora studied her for a long moment, something like genuine concern softening her sharp features. "You should be careful, my dear. Whatever happened to Margaret Lowell all those years ago, and whatever happened to that young investigator more recently, it's clear this family has proven quite capable of making inconvenient truths disappear entirely." "I appreciate the warning," Alina said, "but I've already come too far to turn back now. Margaret deserves to have her story told, whatever the truth turns out to be. And if someone else was silenced trying to uncover that same truth, then I owe it to them as well to finish what they started." As Alina and Higgins prepared to leave, Nora caught her hand at the door, her grip surprisingly firm for a woman her age. "There's one more thing," she said quietly. "My grandmother always believed, until the day she passed, that Margaret's child survived. She said there were whispers among the older staff, careful and quiet, suggesting the child had been sent away separately, placed somewhere far from Thornfield Hall, under circumstances the family took great pains to obscure." Alina's breath caught in her throat. If that's true, if the child survived and has descendants somewhere out there, unaware of their true lineage, that would completely upend the entire Grantham family's claim to their title and estate. "Precisely," Nora said, her expression grave. "Which is likely exactly why the family has fought so hard, for 90 years, to ensure that truth never sees the light of day." Alina thanked Nora warmly and made her way back to the car alongside Higgins, her mind now spinning with new possibilities and new dangers. What had begun as a simple mystery surrounding a forgotten portrait had grown into something far larger, far more consequential, a hidden truth capable of reshaping an entire family's future, and one that had already, it seemed, claimed at least one previous victim in the decades since Margaret Lowell's original disappearance. As they drove back toward Thornfield Hall beneath a sky beginning to darken with the approach of evening, Alina could not shake the growing certainty that she, too, might now be walking directly into the same danger that had swallowed both Margaret and the mysterious young investigator before her. But there was no turning back now, not when the truth felt this close, waiting patiently within the walls of a house that had kept its secrets far too long already. Back at Thornfield Hall, Alina could not stop thinking about the carved words on the windowsill. They took her. 3 simple words, scratched by someone desperate enough to leave a warning behind for whoever might one day find it. That evening, after a quiet dinner shared with Higgins in the kitchen, Alina returned to the sealed nursery wing, this time armed with a proper torch rather than relying solely on Higgins's old oil lamp. She wanted to examine the rooms more thoroughly, certain that something more had to be hidden within those walls beyond the diary and the trunk she had already discovered. Higgins accompanied her, though his reluctance was clear in every careful step he took down the narrow corridor. "What exactly are you hoping to find?" he asked, watching as Alina ran her hands along the walls of Margaret's old bedroom, tapping gently in places, listening for any hint of hollow space behind the plaster. "I don't know exactly," Alina admitted. "But someone went to a great deal of trouble to seal this entire wing, far beyond what a simple scandal would require. There has to be a reason beyond just hiding an inconvenient pregnancy." She continued her careful search, moving from the bedroom into the small adjoining sitting room, running her fingers along the edges of the fireplace, the window frames, the built-in bookshelves that lined one wall. It was nearly 20 minutes before her efforts yielded anything of interest, and when they did, it came almost by accident. Alina leaned against the fireplace mantel, momentarily resting her tired arms, when she felt something shift slightly beneath her palm. She straightened immediately, pressing her hand more firmly against the same spot, feeling a faint give in the stone that should not have been there. "Higgins," she said, excitement creeping into her voice, "bring the light closer." Together, they examined the fireplace more closely, and Alina soon discovered a section of stone along the interior wall that appeared subtly different from the surrounding material, the mortar lines slightly less weathered, as though this particular section had been repaired or altered at some point after the original construction. "This has been bricked over," Alina said, running her fingers along the telltale seams. Deliberately, and not particularly long after the rest of the fireplace was built, judging by how well it matches the surrounding stone. Higgins examined the area with growing interest of his own, his earlier reluctance giving way to genuine curiosity. There could be an old storage space back there, common enough in houses of this age, or perhaps something else entirely. Alina searched the room for anything sturdy enough to help break through the aged mortar, eventually settling on a heavy iron fire poker she found propped in the corner, clearly untouched for decades. She worked carefully at the seams, Higgins assisting where he could, both of them growing increasingly determined as small chunks of old mortar began to crumble away beneath their efforts. It took the better part of an hour, but eventually a section of the false wall gave way entirely, revealing a narrow hidden space behind the fireplace, roughly the size of a small closet, dark and thick with the scent of decades of stagnant, undisturbed air. Alina shone her torch into the opening, her heart pounding as the light revealed the contents within. It was a room, small but clearly furnished with deliberate care. A narrow cot sat against one wall, its blankets still folded, undisturbed. A small writing desk occupied the corner, along with a single chair. Shelves lined one wall, holding a modest collection of books and what appeared to be additional personal items, a hairbrush, a small mirror, a few pieces of simple jewelry. "This was where she hid," Alina said softly, stepping carefully into the narrow space. "This is where Margaret was kept before whatever happened to her." Higgins followed close behind, his expression grim as he took in the small, forgotten room. Kept or hidden by choice. There's a difference, and an important one. Alina moved toward the writing desk, finding a stack of letters bound together with a faded ribbon, tucked carefully into the top drawer. She lifted them gently, her hands trembling slightly as she recognized the same elegant handwriting from Margaret's diary on the outer envelope. "These are addressed to Edmund," Alina said, examining the top letter carefully. "But never sent." She untied the ribbon carefully and began reading through the letters, each one dated, each one painting a clearer picture of Margaret's final weeks within the walls of Thornfield Hall. "My dearest Edmund," the first letter began, "they have moved me to a smaller room, one I do not believe even the household staff knows exists. The old Duke himself explained it as a precaution for my health, though I understand now it is simply a more thorough form of imprisonment than my previous chambers allowed. I am permitted no visitors, no correspondence. Save for these letters I write knowing full well they may never reach you." Alina continued reading, moving through letter after letter, watching as Margaret's tone shifted from cautious hope to mounting desperation. "They tell me our child will be cared for, sent somewhere safe and comfortable, raised without ever knowing the truth of their birth. I do not know if I believe them, Edmund. I do not know if I am meant to survive this confinement at all, or if this hidden room is simply meant to keep me quiet until they decide what final arrangement suits the family best. If you receive these letters somehow, if fate allows them to reach you despite everything working against us, know that I think of you constantly, that I have not given up hope of finding a way back to you, back to the life we dreamed of building together." Alina's throat tightened with emotion as she read the final letter in the stack, dated only days before the diary's final entry. "They have decided, Edmund. I overheard the old Duke speaking with someone late last night, a doctor perhaps, or someone claiming that title. They mean to say I fell gravely ill, that my condition worsened suddenly and tragically. I do not fully understand what this means for my future, though I fear the worst. If you ever find this room, if you ever read these words, please know that I fought as hard as I possibly could. Please know that I loved you completely, and that whatever they claim happened to me, you must never believe I simply gave up or walked away willingly. Our child deserves the truth, Edmund, whatever it may cost to eventually bring it to light." Alina set the final letter down, her hands trembling, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. The picture forming in her mind was growing darker, more disturbing with every new discovery. Margaret had not simply been sent away quietly. She had been imprisoned within her own family home, hidden in a secret room behind a sealed fireplace, while the family prepared some elaborate deception to explain her eventual disappearance. "They faked her death," Alina said slowly, the full weight of the realization settling over her. "Or planned to. That's what these letters suggest. A staged illness, a convenient tragedy to explain away a young woman who had become deeply inconvenient to the family's reputation." Higgins had gone very pale, staring at the small hidden room with an expression of genuine horror. "If that's true, Miss Marsh, then we are dealing with something far darker than a simple family scandal. We're dealing with something that sounds disturbingly close to a family willing to go to any length necessary to protect their name," Alina said, her voice hardening with resolve. "And if they were willing to do this to Margaret 90 years ago, I have to wonder just how far the current Duke might be willing to go to keep that same truth buried today." As if summoned by her very thoughts, the sound of a car engine echoed faintly from outside the house, growing steadily louder as it approached along the gravel drive. Higgins moved quickly toward the window of the outer nursery room, peering down toward the courtyard below, his expression shifting rapidly from surprise to genuine alarm. "Miss Marsh," he said, his voice tight with warning, "I believe the Duke has decided to pay you a visit after all, and judging by the second car following close behind his own, I do not believe he has come alone." Alina felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she quickly gathered the letters, tucking them safely alongside the diary and notebook already in her possession. Whatever the Duke intended by arriving unannounced, with company in tow, she had a strong suspicion it was not to offer a friendly greeting. The truth she had uncovered within these hidden walls was clearly far more dangerous than she had first imagined, and now, it seemed, that danger had arrived directly at her doorstep. Alina and Higgins made their way quickly back through the sealed wing, locking the heavy door behind them out of instinct more than any real belief it would matter now. By the time they reached the entrance hall, headlights were already sweeping across the courtyard outside, and the sound of car doors closing echoed sharply through the quiet evening air. Alina opened the front door just as Duke Alistair Grantham reached the top of the stone steps, his expression tight and unreadable in the fading light. Behind him stood two other figures, a woman Alina did not recognize, dressed in an expensive coat that seemed entirely out of place against the backdrop of the crumbling estate, and an older man carrying a leather briefcase who had the unmistakable bearing of a solicitor. "Miss Marsh," the Duke said, his voice carefully controlled despite the tension visible in his shoulders. "I apologize for the unannounced visit, but I felt it necessary, given the nature of our earlier conversation." "You could have called ahead," Alina replied evenly, refusing to step aside from the doorway. "I thought a more direct conversation might prove more productive," the Duke said. "May we come in?" Alina hesitated, glancing briefly at Higgins beside her, whose expression remained wary but steady. After a moment she stepped back, allowing the small group entry into the grand, dusty entrance hall. "This is my associate, Mrs. Pryor," the Duke said, gesturing toward the woman in the expensive coat, "and my solicitor, Mr. Ashford." "I've spoken with your office already," Alina said, addressing Mr. Ashford directly. "Your assistant was not particularly forthcoming with information." "I apologize for that," Mr. Ashford said smoothly, though his tone carried little genuine warmth. "I'm here now to discuss matters more thoroughly, in person, as the Duke requested." They moved into the drawing room, the same room draped in white sheets that Alina had toured with Higgins on her very first day. The Duke seemed visibly uncomfortable within these walls, his eyes darting occasionally toward the covered furniture, the faded portraits, as though the very room held memories he would rather not confront. "I understand you've discovered a great deal about this house's history," the Duke began, once they had all found seats amid the dust-covered furnishings. "More, perhaps, than I anticipated you might uncover so quickly." "I found Margaret Lowell's diary," Alina said plainly. "I found her nursery, sealed away for 90 years. And this evening, I found a hidden room behind the fireplace, complete with letters detailing exactly how she was imprisoned within her own family's home before she disappeared entirely." The Duke's composure cracked visibly at that, his face paling several shades in the dim lamplight. Mrs. Pryor, seated beside him, shifted uncomfortably, exchanging a brief glance with Mr. Ashford that Alina did not miss. "You cannot possibly understand the full context of what happened during that period," the Duke said, his voice tight with something that sounded almost like genuine anguish beneath the practiced control. "Then explain it to me," Alina pressed. "Because right now, everything I've found suggests your family imprisoned a young woman, planned to fake her death, and separated her forever from the man she loved and the child she was carrying, simply to protect your family's reputation." "It was a different era, Miss Marsh," Mr. Ashford interjected smoothly. "Different expectations governed families of standing during that time. What may seem cruel by today's standards was, unfortunately, not entirely uncommon practice among." "Don't," Alina cut him off sharply, "don't dress up imprisonment and deception as simply the customs of a different time. Whatever happened to Margaret Lowell was wrong then, and it remains wrong now, regardless of how many decades have passed since." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly together in his lap, his gaze fixed somewhere on the dusty floor rather than meeting Alina's eyes directly. My grandfather, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, was the old Duke referenced in those letters. He believed, quite genuinely I think, that he was protecting the family from ruin. A scandal of that magnitude in that era could have destroyed everything the Grantham name represented for generations. So he imprisoned his own relative, planned to fake her death, and separated a child from both of its parents, Alina said flatly. All to protect a family name. I did not say his choices were justified, the Duke said, a note of genuine bitterness creeping into his voice now. I have carried the weight of what my grandfather did for my entire adult life, Miss Marsh, ever since I first learned the truth myself, many years ago. How did you learn it? Alina asked, something in his tone catching her attention. The Duke exchanged another brief, uneasy glance with Mrs. Pryor before answering. A man came to me, some 20 years ago now, claiming to have uncovered evidence of what truly happened to Margaret Lowell. He believed her child had survived, placed somewhere outside the family entirely, and that this surviving heir would have a legitimate claim to challenge the current line of inheritance. Alina's pulse quickened. The investigator whose notebook I found in the sealed trunk. The Duke nodded slowly. His name was Daniel Whitmore. He came to me directly, rather than making his findings public immediately, offering me the chance to address the matter privately before he pursued any legal challenge on behalf of Margaret's descendants. And what did you do? Alina asked, though she suspected she already understood the shape of the answer. I panicked, the Duke admitted, his voice heavy with something that sounded genuinely close to shame. I paid him a substantial sum to abandon his investigation, to destroy whatever evidence he had gathered, and to never speak of the matter again. I told myself I was protecting my own children, my own family's future, though I have come to understand over the years that I was simply repeating the same cowardice my grandfather displayed decades earlier. Did he take the money? Alina asked. He did, the Duke said. Though clearly, based on what you've discovered in that trunk, he did not fully abandon his research as he promised. He must have hidden copies of his findings within the sealed wing before ultimately disappearing from my life entirely, presumably to build a new life elsewhere with the money I provided. Alina studied the Duke carefully, searching his face for any sign of deception, any hint that this carefully constructed story was simply another layer of the family's ongoing effort to control the narrative. Why give me this house, then? She asked. If you were so determined to keep this secret buried, why place me directly in the one location most likely to reveal it? The Duke's expression grew more pained, his eyes finally lifting to meet Alina's directly. Honestly, Miss Marsh, I believed you would simply sell the property quickly and move on with your life, exactly as you initially indicated you might. I never anticipated you would choose to stay, to dig as deeply as you have. I offered you this estate purely as a means of resolving an awkward family obligation, without ever truly considering the history still buried within its walls. You wanted me gone out of convenience without realizing what convenience might cost you, Alina said slowly, the full picture finally clicking into place. Yes, the Duke admitted quietly. And now that you've uncovered so much, I find myself facing a decision I have avoided for 20 years. Do I once again attempt to bury this truth, at whatever cost that requires? Or do I finally allow it to surface, regardless of what that might mean for my family's standing, and for my own position within it? The room fell silent, heavy with the weight of 90 years of secrets finally reaching their breaking point. Alina glanced toward Higgins, whose expression remained carefully neutral, though she could see the same cautious hope reflected in his eyes that she felt building steadily within her own chest. There's still the matter of the child, Alina said finally. If Margaret's child survived, there are living descendants out there somewhere, entirely unaware of their true heritage. Don't they deserve to know the truth, regardless of what it costs your family? The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting once more toward the dusty, sheet-covered furniture surrounding them, as though searching within the very fabric of the house itself for some final answer. "Daniel Whitmore's notes," he said eventually. "Did they include any specific information about where the child might have been placed?" "Not that I've found yet," Alina admitted, "though I intend to keep searching until I do." The Duke nodded slowly, something shifting behind his tired eyes, a weariness that seemed to stretch back far longer than his own lifetime. "Then perhaps, Miss Marsh, it is time we search together. I find I am tired of carrying this particular burden alone." Mrs. Pryor and Mr. Ashford exchanged another uneasy glance, clearly unprepared for this sudden shift in the Duke's position, but Alina barely noticed their reaction, her attention fully absorbed by the unexpected offer now hanging in the air between them. For the first time since arriving at Thornfield Hall, Alina allowed herself to believe that the truth, however painful, however long buried, might finally have a genuine chance of reaching the light after 90 long years of careful, deliberate silence. The following days passed in a flurry of research unlike anything Alina had experienced before. With the Duke's unexpected cooperation, doors that had remained firmly closed for 90 years finally began to open. Mr. Ashford arranged access to the family's private archive, a collection of documents held in a secure office in London, far more extensive than anything Alina could have accessed on her own. Together with Higgins, and occasionally the Duke himself, Alina spent long hours combing through old records, correspondence, and financial documents from the 1930s, searching for any trace of what had truly happened to Margaret Lowell and her child. The breakthrough came on the third day, buried within a ledger of household expenses from that era. A payment, substantial for its time, made to a private nursing home some 60 miles from Thornfield Hall, dated only weeks after Margaret's final diary entry. The payment was listed simply as medical accommodation, with no further explanation attached. "A nursing home," Alina said, showing the entry to the Duke. "Not a burial, not a death certificate, a payment for ongoing care." The Duke studied the entry carefully, his expression grave. "If she was placed in a nursing facility rather than killed outright, there may be additional records, admission papers, perhaps even a death certificate eventually, if she did not survive long term." Further digging through the archive revealed exactly that. A formal admission record, dated the same week as the ledger entry, listing a patient named Margaret Ellison, a fabricated surname clearly chosen to obscure her true identity. The admission notes described a diagnosis of severe nervous exhaustion, a common enough label used during that era to explain away all manner of inconvenient circumstances. "They didn't kill her," Alina said, relief and horror mingling uncomfortably in her chest as she read through the fragile documents. "They hid her away instead under a false name, in a facility far from anyone who might recognize her." "For how long?" Higgins asked quietly, peering over her shoulder at the aging paperwork. Alina continued searching through the file, eventually locating a final entry, a death certificate dated nearly 11 years after Margaret's original admission, listing the cause of death simply as complications related to long-term illness. 11 years, Alina said softly, the weight of that number settling heavily over the room. She lived 11 more years, hidden away under a false name, separated entirely from the man she loved and the child she gave birth to, believing quite possibly that everyone she cared about had simply abandoned her. The Duke's face had gone pale, his hands trembling slightly as he took the document from Alina's hands to examine it himself. "My grandfather allowed this to happen," he said, his voice hollow with genuine horror. "Not a quick, merciful ending, but 11 years of isolation and confinement, followed by a lonely death in a facility under a stranger's name." "What about the child?" Alina pressed gently. "Was there any birth record among these documents?" It took another full day of searching before they finally located it, a birth record from a small private hospital, dated approximately 7 months after Margaret's admission to the nursing facility. The child, a daughter, had been registered under yet another false surname, with the parents listed simply as unknown. The child immediately placed into the care of a respectable family in a neighboring county, arranged quietly through a private adoption broker whose fees appeared, once again, within the Grantham family's old financial ledgers. They separated a mother from her newborn daughter, Alina said, her voice thick with barely contained emotion, and then hid Margaret away for another decade, letting her live and die believing her child had perhaps never even survived, for all we know. The Duke sat back heavily in his chair, his composure finally breaking entirely as the full weight of his grandfather's actions settled over him. "I knew the broad strokes of this tragedy," he admitted, his voice unsteady. "Daniel Whitmore explained much of it to me 20 years ago. But seeing the actual documents, the precise cruelty laid out so clearly in cold financial records, it is far worse than I allowed myself to fully imagine." Alina felt a similar wave of anger and sorrow wash over her, though beneath it, a fierce determination continued to burn steadily. They had come this far. They could not stop now, not when they were finally close to understanding the full truth of what had happened, and more importantly, what had become of Margaret's daughter and any descendants who might still be living today. "We need to find out what happened to Daniel Whitmore," Alina said, redirecting their focus. "He clearly continued his investigation privately, even after accepting your payment to abandon it publicly. If he found any additional information about Margaret's daughter, about where she might have ended up, it could be exactly what we need to locate her descendants today." The Duke nodded slowly, gathering himself with visible effort. "I have not spoken with Daniel Whitmore in nearly 20 years, not since our original arrangement, but I do recall the address he provided at the time for purposes of arranging the payment transfer." Mr. Ashford, who had remained largely silent throughout the intense research of the past several days, finally spoke up from where he sat reviewing additional documents nearby. "I retain records of that transaction, Your Grace, if you wish me to locate the original address." Within the hour, Mr. Ashford produced an old file containing Daniel Whitmore's details from 20 years prior, including an address in a small town in Yorkshire. Alina immediately began searching for any current information about the address, though the trail proved frustratingly cold. Property records showed the house had changed hands multiple times over the intervening decades, with no clear indication of where Daniel Whitmore himself might have relocated afterward. "We need to visit Yorkshire," Alina said finally, determination hardening in her voice. "Someone in that town may remember him, may know where he eventually settled. If he continued his investigation privately, using the money you paid him, there's a strong chance he made additional progress we haven't yet discovered." The Duke agreed readily, and within 2 days, Alina, Higgins, and the Duke himself found themselves making the long drive north toward the small Yorkshire town listed in Daniel Whitmore's old file. The town proved small and unassuming, much like Hollowmere, though its local pub yielded their first useful lead. An elderly bartender, after some careful prompting and the gentle persuasion of a generous tip, recalled a man matching Daniel Whitmore's description who had lived in the area briefly some 15 years earlier, before relocating to a nearby city for work, reasons the bartender could not quite remember. Further inquiries at the local library, where an aging newspaper archive still remained partially intact, eventually revealed a brief article from roughly a decade earlier, mentioning a local historian named Daniel Whitmore, who had published a small, privately printed book focused on genealogy research within the region. "A genealogy researcher," Alina said, excitement building steadily in her chest as she photographed the brief article with her phone. "That fits perfectly with someone continuing to investigate Margaret's daughter's lineage, even after officially abandoning his original investigation." It took another full day of careful searching, contacting local historical societies and genealogy groups throughout the region, before Alina finally received a response that changed everything. A local historical society confirmed that Daniel Whitmore had indeed lived in their area for several years, working as an independent genealogy researcher, though he had passed away peacefully some 3 years earlier, leaving behind no immediate family of his own. However, the society's contact person mentioned something else entirely, something that made Alina's breath catch sharply in her chest. Daniel Whitmore had donated his entire personal research archive to their historical society upon his passing, a substantial collection of documents focused primarily on obscure inheritance disputes and genealogical mysteries throughout the region. Would it be possible for us to review that archive? Alina asked immediately, barely containing her excitement. The society agreed readily, and within another 2 days, Alina, Higgins, and the Duke found themselves seated in a small, quiet reading room, carefully sorting through box after box of Daniel Whitmore's personal research files, searching desperately for any mention of Margaret Lowell, or the daughter who had been taken from her so many decades before. It was Higgins, surprisingly, who finally discovered the crucial file, tucked carefully within a folder labeled simply Grantham Inheritance, dated several years after his original investigation had officially concluded. Inside, they found detailed notes tracing Margaret's daughter through several decades of adoption records, marriage certificates, and birth announcements, painstakingly assembled through years of quiet, persistent research. The trail eventually led to a name that made the Duke visibly pale as Alina read it aloud. Margaret's daughter, raised under the surname Hale within her adoptive family, had eventually married and had children of her own, before passing away just over 20 years earlier. But according to Daniel Whitmore's careful notes, she had left behind a son, still living, entirely unaware of his true lineage, currently residing in a small coastal town not far from where they now sat. The son's name, written clearly at the bottom of Daniel Whitmore's final research notes, was Oliver Hale. "He's still alive," Alina said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of 90 years finally reaching this precise, extraordinary moment. "Margaret's grandson is still alive, and he has absolutely no idea that his true heritage connects him directly to the Grantham family, or that his existence alone could completely reshape everything this family has spent nearly a century trying desperately to protect." The Duke sat in stunned silence, staring down at Daniel Whitmore's careful notes, the full weight of 90 years of family secrecy finally converging into a single, undeniable truth that could no longer be hidden, bought off, or quietly buried away within a sealed and forgotten room. "Then I suppose," the Duke said finally, his voice heavy but strangely resolved, "it is time we paid Mr. Hale a visit and finally told him the truth his family has been denied for far too long." The coastal town where Oliver Hale lived turned out to be a modest fishing community, its narrow streets lined with weathered cottages and small shops selling fresh catch and local crafts. Alina, Higgins, and the Duke arrived on a bright afternoon, the salt air sharp and clean after so many days spent buried within dusty archives and old paperwork. They found Oliver Hale's address easily enough, a small cottage near the edge of town, its front garden neat and well-tended, a stark contrast to the wild overgrowth surrounding Thornfield Hall. Alina felt a nervous flutter in her chest as they approached the front door, uncertain exactly how to explain the extraordinary truth they had traveled so far to deliver. The man who answered the door appeared to be in his early 50s, with kind eyes and a weathered, friendly face that suggested a life spent largely outdoors. He looked between the three unfamiliar visitors with polite confusion. "Can I help you?" he asked. "Mr. Hale," Alina said carefully, "my name is Alina Marsh. This is Higgins, and this is Duke Alastair Grantham. We've come a long way to speak with you about something rather important regarding your family history." Oliver's brow furrowed slightly at the mention of the Duke's title, though his expression remained more curious than alarmed. "I'm afraid I don't have any connection to nobility, Miss Marsh. My family has always been quite ordinary, fishermen and shopkeepers, nothing grand about our history. That's actually part of what we've come to discuss, Alina said gently. May we come in? I promise this will make far more sense once we've had a chance to properly explain. Oliver hesitated only briefly before stepping back, allowing them entry into a modest but comfortable sitting room, decorated with photographs of what appeared to be several generations of family gatherings, fishing trips, and simple, happy moments. Once they were all seated, Alina began carefully explaining everything they had discovered, starting with the letter that had brought her to Thornfield Hall, through the diary, the hidden room, and eventually the careful research trail left behind by Daniel Whitmore that had ultimately led them directly to Oliver's door. Oliver listened in increasingly stunned silence, his expression shifting from polite curiosity to genuine shock as the pieces of his own hidden heritage began falling into place before him. "You're telling me," he said slowly, once Alina had finished, "that my grandmother, the woman I always believed was simply adopted under mysterious circumstances, was actually the secret daughter of a woman imprisoned by a wealthy family determined to hide a scandal." "Yes," Alina confirmed gently. "Margaret Lowell was your great-grandmother, and based on everything we've uncovered, you are the last surviving direct descendant of a woman who was cruelly separated from her child and confined for over a decade, simply to protect a family's reputation." Oliver sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to process the enormity of what he had just learned. "I always knew my grandmother's origins were something of a mystery," he said finally. "She rarely spoke of her childhood, only mentioned once or twice that she had been adopted as an infant, raised by a loving family who never fully explained where she had originally come from." "Did she ever mention anything else?" Alina asked carefully. "Any small detail that might have hinted at her true origins?" Oliver was quiet for a long moment, clearly searching his memory carefully. "There was one thing," he said eventually. "She kept a small ring, quite old, with a dark stone. She wore it constantly, though she never explained where it had come from. She left it to me when she passed, actually. It's upstairs if you'd like to see it." Alina felt a sharp jolt of recognition, remembering the portrait hanging in her bedroom at Thornfield Hall, the small ring painted carefully on Margaret's folded hands. "I believe that ring may have belonged to Margaret herself," Alina said softly. "There's a portrait of her at Thornfield Hall, wearing what appears to be the very same ring." Oliver rose quickly, disappearing upstairs for several minutes before returning with a small, worn box. Inside, nestled carefully in faded velvet, sat a delicate ring, its dark stone catching the afternoon light streaming through the cottage windows. The Duke leaned forward, examining the ring closely, his expression growing increasingly solemn. "This ring has been part of the Grantham family for generations," he said quietly. "It disappeared from the family records shortly after Margaret's disappearance, listed simply as lost during that era. I never understood the significance until this very moment." "She must have kept it hidden," Alina said, piecing together the final threads of the story. "Perhaps she managed to pass it along somehow before being taken to the nursing facility, ensuring some small piece of her true identity would eventually find its way to her daughter, and ultimately to you." Oliver held the ring carefully, staring at it with an expression that mixed wonder, sorrow, and something that looked remarkably like quiet vindication. "All these years," he said softly, "and I never knew the true story behind this ring, behind my own grandmother's origins." The Duke cleared his throat, his expression grave but resolute. "Mr. Hale, I owe you and your family an apology that can never truly make amends for what my grandfather did to your great-grandmother, nor for the decades my own family spent working to keep this truth buried. But I intend to correct this injustice as thoroughly as possible, starting with formally acknowledging your rightful place within the Grantham family lineage." "What exactly does that mean?" Oliver asked, genuine confusion mixing with cautious hope in his voice. "It means," the Duke said carefully, that as Margaret's direct descendant, you hold a legitimate claim to certain rights within the Grantham estate, rights that were unjustly denied to your family for nearly a century. I intend to work with my solicitors to ensure those rights are properly restored, whatever that ultimately requires." Oliver sat in stunned silence for a long moment, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden, dramatic shift in his understanding of his own family history. "I never wanted anything like this," he said finally. "I've lived a simple, happy life here. I'm not certain I know how to process the idea of inherited titles or estates." "You don't have to decide anything immediately," Alina said gently. "But I think, at the very least, you deserve to know the full truth of where you come from, and to have the choice of what role, if any, you wish to play in correcting the injustice done to your great-grandmother." Oliver nodded slowly, still staring down at the small ring in his palm, a tangible connection to a story that had remained hidden for 90 years, finally reaching the one person who deserved to know it most. "I would like to see this house," he said eventually. "Thornfield Hall. I would like to see where my great-grandmother lived and where she was hidden away. I think I owe her that much, after everything she endured." "Then it would be our honor to bring you there," Alina said, feeling a deep, quiet satisfaction settle over her at the thought of finally reuniting this fractured family history, 90 years after it had first been so cruelly torn apart. As they made arrangements for Oliver to travel back with them to Thornfield Hall, Alina found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this exact moment. What had begun as a seemingly cruel gesture, a duke attempting to rid himself of an inconvenient relative by gifting away a crumbling estate, had transformed into something far more significant, an opportunity to finally deliver long overdue justice to a woman whose voice had been silenced for far too long. Margaret Lowell's story was finally, after 90 years, ready to be told in full, and her great-grandson stood ready to help ensure that her memory would never again be buried beneath layers of dust, silence, and carefully guarded family secrets. 2 weeks later, Oliver Hale stood at the entrance of Thornfield Hall for the very first time, staring up at the towering gray stone, the sagging roof lines, and the thick tangles of ivy climbing along the western wall. Despite its obvious decay, there was something undeniably moving about the moment, a direct descendant of Margaret Lowell finally standing where his great-grandmother had once lived, loved, and ultimately suffered so greatly. "It's beautiful," Oliver said quietly, "even in its current state. I can almost imagine what it must have looked like in her time." Alina led him inside, through the grand entrance hall with its curving staircase and dust-covered portraits, up toward the sealed east wing that had held Margaret's secrets for so many decades. She showed him the nursery first, the small cradle and forgotten toys, then the hidden room behind the fireplace, still open from their earlier discovery, the narrow cot and writing desk exactly as they had found them. Oliver moved through each space slowly, reverently, occasionally reaching out to touch a faded surface or examine an old, forgotten object, clearly attempting to absorb the full weight of the history surrounding him. "She wrote letters to Edmund from this very room," Alina explained, showing him the small writing desk where Margaret had penned her desperate, unsent correspondence. "She never gave up hope, even confined here, even facing whatever uncertain fate awaited her." "What happened to Edmund?" Oliver asked. "Do we know?" Alina shook her head slowly. "Not yet, though I intend to keep searching. If he was dismissed from the estate and sent away under false pretenses, there may still be records somewhere indicating where he eventually settled, assuming he lived a full life afterward." They spent the remainder of the day exploring the estate together, Oliver gradually growing more comfortable within the walls that held such a complicated, painful connection to his own heritage. That evening, gathered in the drawing room alongside Higgins and the Duke, Alina laid out the final pieces of the story they had uncovered, painting a complete picture of Margaret's tragic confinement, her eventual death in the nursing facility, and the daughter who had been quietly placed with an adoptive family, entirely unaware of her true origins. "I've spoken extensively with my solicitors this past week," the Duke said, addressing Oliver directly. "While the legal complexities of formally recognizing your lineage within the Grantham family will take considerable time to resolve properly, I want you to know that I am committed to ensuring your family receives full acknowledgement, along with appropriate compensation for the injustice done to your great-grandmother." "I appreciate that," Oliver said carefully, "though I confess I'm still adjusting to the idea of any connection to a family of such standing. My life has always been quite simple, and I find I have little interest in titles or grand estates." "You needn't decide anything regarding titles or formal recognition immediately," the Duke assured him. "But I do hope, at minimum, you'll allow us to properly honor Margaret's memory, and to ensure her story is finally told honestly, rather than remaining buried beneath decades of family silence." Oliver nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward the overgrown gardens visible in the fading evening light. "I think," he said finally, "Margaret would have wanted her story told more than anything else. Whatever comes of titles or inheritance, I would like to help ensure that happens properly." Over the following months, Elena remained at Thornfield Hall, working alongside Higgins, the Duke, and eventually Oliver himself, to begin the long, careful process of restoring the estate to something resembling its former dignity. The gardens were slowly reclaimed from years of wild overgrowth, the crumbling roof repaired section by section, and the dusty, forgotten rooms gradually brought back to life with fresh light and careful attention. Margaret's portrait, once hanging alone and unidentified in a guest bedroom, was moved to a place of honor within the newly restored entrance hall, finally accompanied by a small brass plaque bearing her full name and the dates of her brief, tragic life. Beside it, the Duke commissioned a second portrait, this one of Oliver Hale, painted as a quiet acknowledgement of the family line finally reunited after 90 years of enforced separation. Elena continued her search for information about Edmund Caro, eventually locating records suggesting he had lived a modest life in a distant county, never marrying, working as a groundskeeper for various estates until his death some 30 years earlier. Whether he ever learned the full truth of what happened to Margaret, or whether he carried that uncertainty with him until his own final days, remained impossible to determine with complete certainty. But Elena made arrangements to have a small memorial stone placed within the Thornfield Hall gardens, honoring both Margaret and Edmund together, a quiet acknowledgement of a love that had been so cruelly denied its rightful chance to flourish. Nora Whitfield, upon hearing the full resolution of the story she had helped uncover, wept openly when Elena visited to share the news, expressing quiet gratitude that her grandmother's careful memory of Margaret's story had finally proven instrumental in bringing the truth fully into the light after so many decades of silence. The village of Hollowmere, once distant and disconnected from the affairs of Thornfield Hall, gradually began reconnecting with the estate as restoration efforts continued, local craftsmen and workers finding steady employment in bringing the grand old house back to life, much as it had once employed generations of villagers before the family's long, guilty withdrawal. As for Duke Alastair Grantham, the burden of his family's long-buried secret seemed to lift gradually from his shoulders with each passing month, replaced by a genuine, if still somewhat uncertain, effort to build a real relationship with Oliver and his own children, finally welcoming Margaret's descendants back into the family fold after nearly a century of deliberate exclusion. Elena herself found something unexpected within the walls of Thornfield Hall, beyond simply uncovering a long-buried family tragedy. She found a genuine sense of purpose, a connection to a house and a story that had, in its own strange way, chosen her specifically to bring its long-silenced truth into the light. On a bright spring morning, nearly a year after she had first arrived at Thornfield Hall carrying nothing but 2 suitcases and a deep, stubborn curiosity, Elena stood once more before Margaret's portrait, now properly displayed and honored within the restored entrance hall. The dark, Watchful eyes that had once seemed so filled with longing and warning now seemed, in the warm morning light, to hold something closer to quiet peace. "We found her, Margaret," Elena said softly, more to herself than to the painted figure before her. "We finally found her and brought her home." Behind her, footsteps echoed against the newly polished floors, and Elena turned to find Higgins approaching, a warm smile spreading across his weathered face, an expression far different from the guarded caution he had shown on her very first day at Thornfield Hall. "The gardens are ready for you to see," he said. "The roses have finally begun to bloom again after all these years." Elena smiled, following him toward the tall front doors, out into the bright morning sunlight, where the once wild and overgrown gardens now showed the first genuine signs of careful, patient restoration. The old stone fountain, its broken figure finally repaired, stood proudly once more at the center of the courtyard, water flowing steadily for the first time in generations. What had begun as a duke's careless attempt to rid himself of an unwanted relative had transformed, against every expectation, into the rediscovery and restoration of an entire family's forgotten legacy. Margaret Lowell's 90 years of silence had finally ended, not with further tragedy, but with truth, recognition, and the slow, steady rebuilding of everything her family had lost so long ago. Thornfield Hall, once a crumbling monument to secrecy and shame, stood now as something entirely different, a testament to the power of persistence, of refusing to let inconvenient truths remain buried simply because those in power preferred them forgotten. And Elena Marsh, the woman a duke had once tried so desperately to send away, remained exactly where she belonged, standing firmly among the blooming roses of a garden finally brought back to life, home at last within the walls of a house that had chosen her, quite deliberately it seemed, to finally set its long silenced truth free.